Hi, everyone. Welcome to another Tuesday night Campfire conversation. And tonight we're going to talk with Gary Barkalow about calling. And in particular, we're going to talk about orientation or disorientation, how we get oriented to what our calling is. So, Gary, talk to us a little bit, if you don't mind. I mean, you're here, so you better not mind. Talk to us a little bit about orientation and your experience of it.
Yeah. Let me start with tying into last week just for a second, Sam, as you talked about hearing God, and the point was hearing God in conversation. And so my thought after that was, when it comes to our personal calling, understanding who we are, why we're here, what God has given us that we're supposed to bring to the world, our role, our place in the world. We often think of having those epiphany moments, those times we get away with God, which are extremely important. We create those moments for people. We encourage them to have many of those. But we tend to think of those moments usually infrequent when God seems to speak to us about who we are, what we have to offer, why we're here.
The clouds part, the sun shines down, and we get a voice from heaven, right?
Yeah, that one that you've talked about having.
Every morning.
Well, every morning, I know you're joking, but that's the point I want to make, is that while we need those moments, we really need to be aware of God speaking, directing us moment by moment, day by day, because he does that through all situations, all circumstances. He reveals more of who we are and what he's been doing. Now for us to experience that, because as you said, God speaks to us. We see it in Scripture. It's very clear. It's the norm for him to speak to us. That's what he does with his children. But we have to be oriented. We can't be disoriented, because in a state of disorientation, we don't notice God speaking to us in some way, by some means, and so that's just a state of being disoriented.
So, Gary, John and I are disoriented all the time. We understand
Yes.
disorient, right, John? We understand.
Absolutely. Right? I'm disoriented right now.
So, give us an example of what disorientation does to you.
Well, okay. So for my high school years, my college years, and probably another 10 years after that, I was a competing or performing gymnast. And, every gymnast has the fear of being in a disorienting moment. And gymnastics is a very precise sport. I guess most sports are. But, in gymnastics, you try to understand how a skill is done, with every part of your body. And so sometimes you study it by video, or by tape. You study everything and how it's done, and then you practice the elements, and you do this thing. And to the point where it becomes second nature. It becomes just this motor skills that you have. They're ingrained. And as much as you practice and practice doing these things, there's always, in every gymnast's life at some point, where in the middle of some skill, you become disoriented. You just don't know what's up or down, left or right. You don't know where you are. And it's in that moment that's so fearful, because no matter what amount of skill you've created, you've trained in, no matter how much strength you have, no matter how many times you've done this, it's been routine. At that moment, you have a time of disorientation. And usually all you can do in that moment is typically, and you'll see this as you watch gymnastics, you'll typically see a gymnast put his hands up near his head, and he's bracing for the impact. He's protecting the one thing that he can't afford to break, and that is his neck. But there are just those moments. And it's really true in life too, when we just become disoriented about who we are, why we're here, and what God is up to. We don't know up or down, left or right. And typically what happens is we find ourselves in a state of all we're doing is bracing for the fall, bracing for the hit. That's what being disoriented in this life as a believer can feel like.
Well, Gary, I think that most believers I talk with feel that disorientation when it comes to their purpose, to their calling, what God has for them, why they're here on earth, whatever phrase they want to use. I honestly, most believers, I would say 90% of the believers I know believe there's a purpose, but they don't know what it is. I mean, they sometimes they feel like they're riding a wave. I got my wave, and they're riding it for a year or 2 or 5 years in their career, but they get fired, or they don't do well, or a child gets sick, or something happens. And I think they realize it was like a flash of insight, but it wasn't my calling. And I think part of what we want to do is help people out of their disorientation. So give us one thing that can help us find an orientation, find a true north for our calling.
Okay. So, all of us now, we use Google Maps or Apple Maps or, one of these apps that help us.
I think Apple Maps makes you disoriented again, doesn't it?
It does. So we use these to figure out where we are and how we get to where we need to be. Now part of that requires that we know where we want to go. But nonetheless, when we use these apps, often now we don't understand, because they're on our phone, how they really work. Back in the days when all we had was a GPS unit, those little Garmin things that we bought, and they were either made for backpacking and hiking, the kind you hold in your hand, or they were the other kinds you actually put in your car. Those units only worked if they were triangulating to satellites. And the old Garmin units, they would tell you in there if they were hooked to 1, 2, or 3 or more satellites. And the more they were hooked to, they would tell you that they would be accurate as far as telling you where you are, by so many feet, depending on how many satellites they could hook up to. But they needed to at least have 3 satellites or points of data coming into them, and therefore triangulation. And it's very true for us as well. If we're going to have some understanding of who we are, to some accuracy, who we are, where we are, so that we can figure out where we're going and why we're here, we need to have really kind of 3 points of information coming to us. Our own story is a point of information that's extremely critical, because God's been doing things in our life. Our story, to look back and see his engineering, his architecture in our life, his choreography, if you will. And then we also have to get information from the standpoint of what has he written in our heart in the form of our desires. And then the third is, what is he up to developmentally in our life? Because this is partly what he's doing. He's developing us into the image of Christ, maturing us. So if we could understand those 3 things, we would have a fairly good understanding of who we are, where we are, and what God is up to.
Gary, is there a time or a story from your life that illustrates this, when all of a sudden you found yourself very disoriented, and so you went to those 3 points and you triangulated between the 3, and you were able to get your bearings straight?
Yeah, I'm going to ask you 2 guys the same question. So be prepared now. So, for me, Sam, what you had brought up earlier, the disorienting moments in our life, the loss of a job, or the demotion, or maybe it's a position that you were hoping, a volunteer ministry position, a church you were hoping to have, or something went on in your family that you were not anticipating or would hope would never happen, or a financial loss. I mean, any of these things are disorienting, because I think at least where they get me is this point of, gosh, I thought I knew who I was. I thought I knew what God was up to in my life and what I was supposed to bring to other people. I thought I knew my route and destination. And then all of a sudden we're thinking, I don't think I know anything. I don't even think I can see what God is doing in my life at this point. And they're very disorienting points. And, I've had those in my life many times. And so for instance, there was a time with another organization I was working with, and I got into this organization, and very soon after being hired, I kind of realized I don't think I belong here. I don't think this is who I am. This is not pulling on the strengths. This feels like it's all my weaknesses. This has nothing to do with what I'm passionate about. And I was so disoriented. I was just thinking, okay, either I made a big mistake, or God made a big mistake, or there is no such thing as having a calling, a destiny, the assigned place in our life. And I was really struggling at this point, to the point I thought, all I can do is make the best of this. And the best of this is either I adapt to the situation or I find something else. But God had no place in this. And at a point in time, I felt like really, and I was praying, I was asking God what's up, but I felt like he was bringing me back to several things. One is he was saying to me, Gary, I have you here for a reason. This is important for the now and for the future. And also I felt like he kept reminding me, kept bringing me back with the question of, Gary, what do you love to do? What do you feel like you most powerfully bring to people? And so those questions, those thoughts were very orienting to me in my life.
Let me tell you, John, a time that I feel like understanding my story helped me understand my calling. So when I was 12, my parents used to have everybody pray for that kid. Whenever you turn 12, we would pray and say, what does God want you to do with your life? And I got 4 cards from 4 different people that all basically said, Sam, you're supposed to listen to God's people and speak to God's people. So I thought I should be a pastor, or a missionary. I went to college and I started with physics, and then I took a class called intellectual history and I fell in love with it. So I got a degree in European intellectual history. I went overseas and was a missionary for a little bit. And when I was praying one day, I felt like God say, I shouldn't do it then. So I came back, and there weren't many jobs in 17th century European intellectual history. So I found a job in computers and I did fine. And then after doing that for 25 years, I felt like God say, stop doing it. And now is the time to do mission work. Now, so at this point, I was 50 years old. I felt like God saying, leave your career, the thing that you've been doing for 25 years. And I got some friends to help me figure out, am I hearing God, or is this, just an undigested potato in my stomach? And what we realized as we talked, so they basically, my friends who helped me try to discern this word, basically asked me questions of my life. And, I told them my whole story. I told them about when I was 12, thinking I was supposed to listen to God's people and speak to God's people. And one of the guys pointed out something that I just thought was great. He said, Sam, God gave you a glimmer when you were 12 years old. You had no clue you were probably more disoriented with that glimmer than anything. But my intellectual history, the purpose of intellectual history is to study a culture. It's to listen to a culture, to listen to a people, until you understand them in a way that they don't even understand themselves. Then when I was in computer science, my main job was listening to customers and then getting the software to do what they did and presenting it to them. And they said they felt like what God had done was take me through like his own version of seminary, to train me how to listen to people. I learned to listen literally in school. The whole point of intellectual history is to listen to a people. And the reason I did okay in computers is I could listen to people, partly because I was trained in intellectual history, how to discern the question beneath the question. And they said, Sam, it sounds like God is fulfilling that word from when you were 12 years old now. But they were able to give me an orientation based on, by that point, for almost 40 years of my story, of what God had literally been training in me. So, in a certain sense, God says to David, I trained you to be a shepherd, now I want you to shepherd my people. He says to Peter, I trained you to be a fisherman. Now I'm going to teach you how to fish for people. And I felt like God say to me, he trained me how to listen through the worldly sense. And he was saying, now I want you to do it in a broader sense. So I think I got oriented to my calling mostly through my story.
You know, this is really helpful. And I wasn't kidding a while ago when I said right now I'm disoriented. I really am a little bit, because I'm at a point in my life where career is on the downhill slope. I can see retirement in the not too distant future. The kids are out of the house, and Pam and I are both, we're just seriously praying and thinking about what is our place now and what is it going to be in the future. And we're going through a lot of disorientation right now. In fact, the last 2 years, both of our fathers passed away, and that brought some disorientation. But one of the things that's helped me is going back to what is God's larger story and where do I fit into that? And as we interpret the things that we're going through and the things we're struggling with and the decisions that we have to make that are going to affect us for the rest of our life, we're trying to stay focused on, so what is God's larger story and what is my role to play in his story, and what is my story, but how does it fitting in, and how do these decisions affect how my story plays out in light of his story?
So go ahead, Gary.
Yeah, those are just such good points. And so, yeah, what we wanted to do for everyone listening, what we wanted to do was kind of camp out on this conversation, on this idea of understanding who we are, becoming more oriented, especially with our story. And we'll touch desire and journey, the developmental journey, later. But this is so extremely important because, again, if we look back in our life, if we'll have that discipline, that discernment to look back, we'll see God's hand in this. As you guys are sharing, what I find is really helpful is to look at who has God brought into your life over the years and what did they deposit? Now, not every person that came into our life had a good deposit in our life, but God will use those things to say, through what was done to you, what they brought as harm, I'm going to use for good. I'm going to give you an awareness of this harm that goes on in people's lives because you suffered through this and you know about this. But really looking at the people who deposited something good. I remember decades ago, when we moved to Colorado Springs from California, there was a man who came into my life. I met him in a Sunday school class at church. And he came up to me and introduced himself. Actually, he and his wife to my wife, Lee, and I, and said, hey, we'd love to have you over for a cup of coffee sometime, get to know you. And they ended up discipling, mentoring, walking alongside Lee and I for years. And what he was passionate about is what he called developmental leadership. He was very much into looking at the developmental stages in a person's life, especially in a quote leader's life, and what goes on in those, and how do they develop us, and how do you do it as a leader? How do you develop others through those stages? In fact, he wrote a book called Connecting: The Mentoring Relationships We Need to Succeed. His name was Paul Stanley. He deposited that into my life just out of friendship. And that's become a big part of what I believe I can bring to others and I'm passionate about. Now, at the same time, God brought another person in my life, and his name was Brent Curtis. He was a friend. He was also a counselor in my life. And he's the one that kind of introduced me into this idea of the life of the heart. I had no idea about that whatsoever. And in fact, he ended up co-writing a book called The Sacred Romance. And he deposited that understanding, that experience of the life of the heart in my life, the heart of the life into my life, which has been a great thing. And so, and there have been others, Sam and John right here, they have made huge deposits into my life. And so to look back in our story and say, God, who have you brought into my life and what did they deposit, is a huge clue into who we are and becoming oriented.
Okay, so let's say that we have a few more minutes, and we have a set of people who have never thought about examining their story to understand their calling. Let's just throw out, let's each throw out a few bullet points. Like Gary just said, one of the ways he figured out, one of the orienting points of story is the people God has put into his life and what they particularly bring. Paul Stanley with the mentoring, oh my goodness, Brent Curtis with understanding the life of the heart. So what are other, I don't know what not rules, guidelines or insights for someone to say, okay, I'm going to go back and look at my story with these things in mind? So one thing I would say is, well, sort of they're combined. I told you about a word I got, I think from the Lord when I was 12 years old. I would say to everybody, write down all the things you remember that you think God was speaking to you, either through somebody in a sermon, or just write a set of things down. And, a way to do that sometimes is just review your journal if you keep a journal. I think these are great ways to get some orienting points. What are some other things? If you're talking to someone who's never examined their life as a way of figuring out what their calling is, what other would you say?
Sam, one of the first things that comes to my mind is, and I did this exercise several years ago, I went back through my life and I thought through the major lessons that God taught me on a one-on-one basis. And for example, one of those was in college, where I learned just how free we are in Christ. And the way that happened was through a friend making a casual comment in the student union, but it just hit me like a ton of bricks. And it truly changed my perspective. So I wrote down 4 or 5 different events like that happened throughout my life, and what the lessons were that God taught me that were truly life lessons, and they all began to fit a pattern.
Yeah, that's really good. And I would add to this idea of what other data points do you look at? What other places of intel do you look at, or however you want to put this? And I would say, so yes, the people that God has brought in your life, what did they deposit? What were they about? As you said, Sam, prophetic words, or just words, whatever you call them, however they came to you, words of encouragement. Someone came to you and said, boy, I really see this about you. This is when you light up. This is what you notice that no one else notices, and those kind of things. Those are extremely important. Now, all of this is easy to learn or to lose if we don't write them down. That's why we keep talking about this idea of journal electronically, whether it's just audibly, or it's just something on your phone or iPad or written. The other thing I would say, other data points would be, what is it throughout your life that you have loved to do? Those are these bright moments in your life when you think back at your story, those enjoyable moments, those moments of joy, those moments of fulfillment, right? And again, don't interpret those based on what other people tell you should be fulfilling or should be important or joyful. Just honestly, what did you love? And just write those things down and say, God, what was it about those things that are true of me? Because often what's truest about us is not necessarily the direct activity, but if you dig deeper and say, why did I love doing that? Why do I like those conversations? Why do I like building these things, or painting, or playing music, or poetry, or certain books that I love? Just going back and writing down, identifying those moments of joy, fulfillment, happiness in your life. What were those about? And then I'll throw out another one that I just reminded myself about. And that is, what books have you always loved? What were their subjects, whether it's fiction or nonfiction? What was that about? And asking God, why do I love those things? Or movies that you love. We talk about those all the time, that you watch again and again, and you just enjoy them, or they bring you to tears, or they get your heart going. What were those about? They're all clues in your life. Those are all about your story.
So I'm going to give my last idea, but I'm going to also answer a question that Dave Turner asked. Dave Turner says, how much of figuring out orientation, or how much of figuring out our calling, is internal wiring versus interpreting life experience and skills? And I would say, Dave, that I really believe God has made us each unique with something to bring to the world. And because of the fall, because of our broken lives, because of our broken families, sometimes dysfunctional families, I think most of us have come into the world disoriented. And I think what God is doing is bringing an orientation to us. There is an internal wiring in the way God, there's a design. There's a design from beginning, before the world was made, there's design for Dave Turner and for Gary and John and Sam and everybody else listening. There's a design, and God is trying to help us interpret that. That's why there's a mystery. There is something out there that we don't know, but there is something. There really is an answer, and God is trying to help us find that. And so, we've mentioned friends, we've mentioned events, interpreting events, we've mentioned deposits people have made into our lives. We mentioned words. One of the things I would say, and this goes hand in hand with us talking about hearing God, I would say one of the ways we come to know our story is ask God why different things happened in our lives. I once had a really horrific boss who was a micromanager, who took credit for people. And he was only my boss for a couple of years, and it was a horrible. I mean, we've all had sort of toxic bosses. He was my toxic boss. And I remember saying, God, what? And he was, finally I got a different, better boss. And I said, God, what was that about? And I think God answered me by giving me some things that I really hated about living under that person. And I felt like God saying, I don't want you to be that kind of person. I let you experience this because I want you to run from being a micromanager. I want you to run from taking up credit for other people. I want you to run from stamping down people. And I feel like sometimes God helps us figure out who we are when we see the negatives. As Gary said, some of the bad deposits that we've had in our lives. So I would say, ask God why. Say, God, why did you let this happen? I think God always has a purpose, and I think he'll often speak it to us. So, Gary, any last words before we close?
I would say, we use this metaphor, this expression often, is the idea of collect as many dots as you can before you connect those dots and try to see the picture. And so, with that question, which was such a good question with this, we talked 2 weeks ago about this idea that we all live in mystery, and mystery is God's invitation to be intimate with him, to come back to him, to keep saying, God, I need you to explain this to me. I want to understand, who have you made me to be? Who am I to you? And so there will always be this mystery. It's never going to be black and white because, one, there's a depth to our heart that we just can't easily define. There's a depth to the story that we're living in that we can't easily define. We are growing, maturing in Christ, as well as getting rid of the old man that we were, as God is renewing us, restoring us, redeeming us. So that's always changing. I mean, and then we have the warfare, what's coming against us. So there is so much happening that it's never going to be clear at any one moment. It's just going to become clearer. And so I would say, I really believe, we'll talk about this later, that the theme, if I were to put a theme to the story that we're living in, that John alluded to in the beginning, God's story that he is writing, screenplay, if you will, I think the theme is becoming and overcoming. And because of that, it continues to evolve. It will never be absolutely clear. So I have to keep collecting data, right? This is who I am. This is what I believe God is up to. And then he's going to keep adding more information to it, and it's going to become clearer. But for all of us, it's that struggle of it becoming more and more clear. Never we've reached complete clarity.
John, any last words?
Oh, just quickly, I'm thinking of there's a proverb that says, the heart of man is like deep waters. And I think that's true of our story and our calling. This is just a fun adventure to mine the gold that's in those deep waters. And I would just encourage everybody to go back and listen to this again and take the points that Sam and Gary and I have mentioned and really go after it. Search out what God has put in your heart.
Hey, everyone, we're going to talk again next week about hearing God. And it's really going to connect very closely with today's, because we're going to continue talking about hearing God in conversation. And I really believe one of the key ways that we even understand our story is God explaining it to us, God walking us through that. So join us again next week as we talk about hearing God in conversation. But I want us to connect it with our calling, because calling is both a mystery, but it's also going to be a revelation from God as we walk into it. So we look forward to seeing you next week. Bye, everybody. It's been really fun.